John Robinson was known in Kansas and Missouri as a con man and eventually found himself locked up for about 6 years in state prison. But when he was released, the prison librarian moved to be with him, and then she disappeared. It would take 4 more women to go missing before he was stopped. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Welcome to Crimelines and part 2 of this look into Kansas City serial killer John Robinson and all of his crimes. This case is local to me and only partially resolved, so my hope is that one day we can have it fully resolved, but we can't if we stop talking about it, so let's keep going. I want to just send a quick thank you to my editor, Nico, who I thank plenty in emails, but I'm going to thank again here. He was willing to pick up this extra episode so that we can have this 3-parter come out in 1 week's time versus stretching it out. So a huge thank you to Nico. Last episode, we talked about the first 3 murder victims. Paula Godfrey, a promising figure skater hoping to go pro. Lisa Stacy, a young mother trying to accept a helping hand to make a better future for herself and her daughter. And Catherine Clampett, a woman working to get back on her feet and thought she got the job opportunity of her dreams. And of course, we have the surviving victims like Tiffany, the baby who was taken from her mother, her adoptive parents who had to struggle years later with their love for their daughter and their disgust over how John Robinson brought her into their lives. And of course, we have the large number of people who lost their money to his many schemes and any of the women he coerced into sex work. Today, we are going to talk about the next known victims of John Robinson, starting with 49-year-old Beverly Bonner. If you remember from last time, Beverly met John while he was serving a sentence for probation violations related to fraud in Missouri. He promised her a job with world travel, and restless in her life in a small town, she took him up on it. After he was paroled, she left her husband and moved to Olathe, Kansas, to work for John. Beverly told her neighbor that any mail that showed up for her needed to be forwarded to a post office box at a place called the Mailroom, located in the Crosswoods Shopping Center in Olathe. This mailbox was opened by someone going by the name James Turner on January 1st, 1994. So we have John Osborne and James Turner as known aliases of John Robinson. John told the owner of the mailroom that he was collecting mail for Beverly while she was in Australia for work. And according to the owner, the only person who ever accessed that mailbox was John Robinson. This address was the one Beverly gave for the mailing of her alimony checks, which her ex-husband dutifully sent every month. And every month for the next 18 months, these checks, which were at about $1,000, were cashed. It's not exactly clear when in those 18 months Beverly went missing. We do know she made it to Olathe, as she called her mother from there. She told her that she wanted her to change John's name from John Robinson to John Redman in her address book, saying that that was actually his real name. It's likely John told her to make this call, but it's not really clear what excuse he would have given Beverly to do so. But it's obvious he did not want his name coming up in relation to Beverly. In January of 1994, one of Beverly's brothers received a handwritten letter from her that said she was heading to Chicago for a new job that would require a lot of travel. Beverly then appeared in person at her final divorce hearing in February of 1994. She told people around that time that she would be going overseas for work, and it's believed she must not have lived much past this because it was still winter when the owner of the storage unit John rented saw him load a large metal barrel into his storage space. He said he rented the unit for his sister Beverly, who was in Australia for work. Beverly's brother then received another letter, but this one was not handwritten, it was typed. He had never received a typed letter from his sister before, and in it she said she was working for a Jim Redmond. Every few months, he would receive another letter postmarked from random parts of the world, as did their other brother. The letters were all typed, but signed with what looked like Beverly's signature. Because of these letters, Beverly's family didn't immediately report her missing. She seemed to be healthy and happy traveling the globe. They did think things were odd, though, when her brother got married in September of 1995 and she didn't show up for the wedding. Later that year, one of her 2 sons died, and she didn't come to the funeral or contact anyone about it. Like I said, these alimony checks were sent and cashed for 18 months, being deposited into John's Hydro Grow business account. And when the checks stopped, so did the letters from Beverly. After this sudden drop in all communication, the family contacted the police to report her missing. The police collected several of the letters and envelopes from the correspondence, and this would be important later as a DNA profile would be developed. But let's not jump ahead. Like the previous 3 victims, 4 if you count Tiffany as she was still a missing person at this point, John was known to have connections to this missing person. But in this case, because of the multiple names and the time between Beverly moving there and being reported missing, he wasn't initially connected. So once again, John Robinson got away with it, for now at least, and then he got on the internet. For many years up to this point, John was into the local BDSM scene in Kansas City, running that Troost apartment as a BDSM brothel at some points. With the internet, however, he could look outside the Kansas City metro area and search worldwide for women to talk to and, as we will see, lure to Kansas City. The online name he used the most was Slave Master, which gives you an idea of the role he had in these relationships. The majority of John's relationships were carried out start to finish online, but not all of them. And one that crossed into the real world was that of Sheila Faith. Sheila was born Sheila Howell in 1948 in Dallas. After her parents' divorce, her mom had moved her and her 4 siblings in with their grandmother, and then one day, her mother left. Just left the 5 kids with their grandmother to raise them. After a while, her mother did come back and tried to get the kids, but at this point, her grandmother just refused to allow it. Sheila was very quiet in high school and did not have a lot of friends, but at some point, she met and married John Faith. Together, they had a daughter named Debbie, who was born in October of 1978. Debbie was born with multiple disabilities, initially being diagnosed with cerebral palsy and then later also with spina bifida. She was a wheelchair user for her entire life and required a lot of care. Unlike her mother, Debbie was incredibly outgoing. She had a close circle of friends. She would race people in her wheelchair, and she loved nothing more than escaping into the drama of soap operas. The little family settled in California. When Debbie was about 13 years old, her father John died of cancer. Because of the care Debbie needed, Sheila didn't work, so losing John was doubly difficult because they also lost their income. Sheila applied for and got Social Security payments to help keep them afloat. They lived on about $1,000 a month and food stamps. But it wasn't just the income Sheila missed. She missed the help, as Debbie started losing more mobility, and lifting her in and out of bed was physically taxing on Sheila as Debbie entered her teen years. And then, of course, Sheila missed the companionship and even the romance of having a partner. In 1993, Sheila met 2 men through personal ads who lived in the Santa Cruz area, and deciding that she would have a better chance of a future with one or the other of them if she lived in the area, she and Debbie moved. Neither relationship ended working out long term, but Debbie had a friend from her old school named Melissa who had moved to Pueblo, Colorado. The family encouraged Sheila and Debbie to move by them so they could help give them the type of support system they needed, so the 2 packed up once again and moved to Colorado. Melissa's mother, Nancy, became close to Sheila, and she was aware that Sheila used personal ads to try to meet men, both ones in the newspaper and ones online. Sheila, at some point, brought up an interest in BDSM, but Nancy did not encourage any details, as it fell into the TMI category for her. It was the spring of 1994 when 45-year-old Sheila Faith told Nancy that she met a man online named John. To place this in our overall timeline, this would have been likely very shortly after Beverly Bonner was last confirmed to be alive. This man, John, lived in the Kansas City area, and he was a wealthy businessman who knew of a private school that could really help Debbie, who was 15 years old. He said he wanted to take care of both mother and daughter, and so much so that he was going to get Debbie a better wheelchair and a state-of-the-art accessible van. Sheila also told her sister about this man, but she gave his name as Jim Turner. Sheila was very excited to meet him in person, so she started making plans for a visit in the summer of 1994. The plan was that she and Debbie would go to Missouri and stay with John for a bit before they continued on to Texas to visit with family. They'd go back to Colorado, but if Sheila and John hit it off in person, she might start looking at moving again. We do know that they did intend to return to Colorado. Not only did they have tickets to the state fair coming up at the end of the summer, Sheila had a cross-stitch project that she planned to enter into one of the fair's contests. And Debbie had told Melissa that they'd be back in time for the first week of school, and she promised to write to her. But after they left town, Debbie never wrote. The reporting varies on how Sheila and Debbie left town. Some reports say she drove herself, but other sources say her beat-up old car would never have made it that far, so John came out to pick them up. It is about a 9-hour drive to get from Pueblo to Kansas City. Sheila and Debbie were gone for a few weeks, and no one was concerned since this was within the timeline Sheila gave. While they were gone, Nancy had gone over to the house to collect the mail like Sheila had asked her to do, but she never found anything in the mailbox. Thinking something was wrong, Nancy went to the post office to ask about it, and they told her that there was already a forwarding request put into place, and all of the mail going to that address was being sent to a P.O. box in Olathe, Kansas. This seemed strange since Sheila had specifically asked Nancy to go pick up her mail, but maybe Sheila just wanted the mail to come straight to her rather than pile up for the weeks she was out of town. Then the state fair came and went, and Sheila and Debbie hadn't come back. And then school started, and the two still hadn't returned. Nancy went out to their home again to check up on them and found that everything was in place, including all their furniture. It definitely didn't look like they planned on never coming back. Nancy then called the landlord, who said he hadn't heard anything from Sheila in regards to moving out. And then she missed her September rent payment, which was very unlike her. Eventually, as we've seen in these other cases, letters started showing up. And true to the pattern of John Robinson's victims, they were typed but signed by Sheila. She wrote that they were so happy in their new life that they were not going to come back. Also, like with other victims, it seemed odd that Sheila typed this letter when normally she handwrote them. Sheila's brother William did not believe the letters were authentic at all, and he called the Social Security Administration. He wanted to know where their checks were being mailed, figuring he could use that address to track down where his sister and niece were. However, that was personal and private information that they wouldn't just release to somebody over the phone. It turned out that all the Social Security checks were being sent to a P.O. box in Olathe, and it was the same mailroom where John had Beverly's alimony checks going to. The owner never saw Debbie or Sheila come into the store. John Robinson, using the name James Turner, was the only one who ever showed up. From July 1994 until September 1995, the Social Security checks were being deposited into the same Hydrogrow business account that Beverly's alimony checks were being deposited into. At that point, the bank told John that disability checks couldn't go into a business account, so he started depositing them into another account. In August of 1994, shortly before people started getting suspicious about where Sheila and Debbie were, the Social Security Administration got a letter from Debbie's doctor verifying that she was 100% disabled and would be for life. The letter was signed by Dr. William Bonner. Yes, John Robinson forged the signature of one victim's ex-husband to verify eligibility for disability checks for another victim. The letters supposedly from Sheila didn't stop for a while. In December 1994, her sister got one postmarked from Canada. A year later, she got another that was typed, but this time the signature looked a bit different from the others. So John was getting Beverly's alimony checks and the Social Security checks from both Sheila and Debbie. In December of 1995, he made good on his promise to that real estate agent in Florida. He now had enough money to put a down payment on a house there, and his oldest son moved in. The plan was to eventually build a second home for John and Nancy on the adjacent lot, but they were going to stay in Kansas City until then. At the same time, Nancy took a different job at a different mobile home park, so they ended up moving 30 minutes away from Belton, Missouri to Olathe, Kansas. Though still married to Nancy, John kept up his online life as slave master, and he tried to get more women to travel to Kansas to meet him. Some did and returned home alive, and many just decided to keep their relationship online. That wasn't to say they didn't send John money, particularly to invest in his various businesses, but of course they never saw any return on that money. In 1997, John met a 19-year-old student named Izabela Lewicka online. Izabela was born in Poland in 1978 and immigrated with her family when she was a teenager in 1993. They settled in Indiana, and Izabela, like a lot of people adjusting to a new country, was initially shy. She was a very creative person who liked to have deep conversations on politics and art, so she stuck with the close friends she had and didn't venture too far outside of that. After high school, her dream was to study fashion design in France. But after touring a few schools there with her father, she decided to just stay closer to the family and enrolled in Purdue University in August 1996. Though Izabela was on the shyer, quieter side of things, she was adventurous, sexually speaking, so meeting people online seemed like a good fit for her. And she met John Robinson in a BDSM chat room and took him up on a job offer and a life in Kansas City with him. After 2 semesters at Purdue, she told her family she got a summer internship illustrating books in Kansas City, and if it worked out, it might lead to a permanent job, and if it didn't, she would be back to Purdue in the fall. Izabela gave her parents an address where they could write to her, and it was another mailbox place, but this time it was in Overland Park. I looked up the address of John's business, Equi2, on Open Corporations, and this mailbox place was basically across the street. At least one of Izabela's friends was told that the job was illustrating BDSM books, while also doing secretarial work for an older married man who was her dom, or dominant partner. These were details that she obviously left out of what she told her parents. Izabela left Indiana in early June 1997. John had a different story about Izabela, and this is what he told one of his other online internet girlfriends about the whole arrangement. He claimed he did not ask Izabela to come to Kansas City. She just emailed him and told him that she was on her way. When she got there, he went to meet up with her in a restaurant and was appalled when he saw her. She was dressed in all black and had piercings, and that just was not what he expected. He claimed he told her to go back to Indiana, but instead she got an apartment in the Westport area of Kansas City. John's story was surely a lie, an excuse to explain Izabela being around while he was stringing this online girlfriend along. Izabela almost immediately went to work on John's mobile home living magazine doing layouts for him, and the two entered a sexual relationship. For someone who supposedly didn't want her to be there, he very quickly integrated her into his life. Because unlike the other victims, Izabela did not go missing right away. Izabela would go to John's home to work on the magazine, so he needed an explanation for how she entered his life. He told some people that she was his niece, and others that she was a friend's daughter, and some that she was an adopted daughter of his. But his behavior towards her, his physical behavior, made people know that there was something else going on. But hey, if John's wife was looking the other way, they would as well. Within a few months of Izabela's arrival in the KC Metro, she and John applied for a marriage license. It was never completed, so they didn't get a certificate, but Izabela added Robinson to her last name, and she told people she was married, and by people, I include her parents in that. It's not clear if Izabela knew that they weren't legally married or she thought they were, but John never filed the paperwork since he was, as we know, already married. So John Robinson was a con man, a kidnapper, and a serial killer, but he decided he drew the line at bigamy. In February 1998, John rented an apartment for Izabela, telling the property manager that she was his adopted daughter. In the fall of 1998, after over a year in the Kansas City area, Izabela enrolled in the local community college, taking a drafting course using Lewicka Robinson as her surname. In January of 1999, Izabela moved into another apartment that John rented for her. All this time, she was working for John in his office that was in his home that he occupied with his wife. Eventually, even Nancy couldn't pretend not to notice that something was going on, and she would later say that she thought John might actually leave her for Izabela, particularly given how long the relationship lasted. And it lasted even after Nancy found out about it, which wasn't how most of his other affairs would go. At the end of the day, when Nancy would learn about the other women and put her foot down, and he had to make a choice, John always chose Nancy. She wasn't so sure he was going to this time. But Nancy's fears were alleviated by the fall of 1999 when everyone started noticing that Izabela was not around anymore. She had been in the Kansas City area for over 2 years. When asked about where Izabela was, John said she had been arrested on drug charges and then deported. People accepted this on face value. Around the time people realized Izabela wasn't around in September 1999, John sold the property in Florida and used the money to buy land in Lynn County, Kansas instead. He put a trailer on the property and referred to it as his farm, but he still spent most of his time living with Nancy. Like what happened in the other cases, Izabela's family kept getting correspondence, supposedly from her. But John had been moving more and more into the digital world, so rather than getting a lot of letters, Izabela mostly sent emails. We do know that Izabela had emailed with her parents while she was alive, but it was sporadic and infrequent. She was fighting for independence from her parents, so they would fall out of contact for periods of time, with her even outright demanding that they just leave her alone. Because they were used to long stretches with no contact, they didn't even report her missing because they didn't know she was. Others did notice her absence, like the people at the bookstore she frequented, but I mean, even with regular customers, you don't call the police when they don't come in for a while. Izabela didn't really have friendships in the Kansas City area where her absence would be immediately missed because her entire life was John. Because of all of this, the exact date Izabela went missing is unknown. It was definitely in 1999, though, because, like I said, she moved into an apartment in January, and then by the fall, people were noticing she wasn't around. But we do have some more information that narrows it down a bit more, and that is when John moved someone else to Kansas. Back in 1993, John had reconnected with an old friend from his teen years named Barbara. He told her that he was single, never married. However, his brother had died, so he adopted and raised his brother's children. At the time, Barbara was married, so she and John were in friendly but not constant contact. Then, in the spring of 1999, Barbara was living in England when she and her husband divorced. She planned to move back to Canada with her family, but John told her she should just move to Kansas with him. Through phone and email contact, they started planning her move, which would also involve a relationship. Not a BDSM one, but intimate nonetheless. John warned Barbara that he would be gone a lot and out of contact on top secret missions with the CIA that he couldn't talk about. She was okay with this because she felt that she and John had a deep connection. And like most narcissistic psychopaths, John could be a chameleon and he could be what Barbara wanted him to be. When Barbara first arrived in Kansas City, John got her a room at an extended stay hotel. Then in August, he rented a duplex for Barbara, which she moved into on August 23rd. He had movers take the furniture from Izabela's apartment and deliver it to the duplex. He later brought her household goods like kitchen stuff, bedding, art for the walls, books, and things like that. Later, these things would be identified as belonging to Izabela. John didn't live at the apartment with Barbara, but he came over a few times a week, and she really thought they had a future together. Barbara wasn't the only woman John was wooing at the time. Another girlfriend, Alicia, had lost her job in the summer of 1999, and John told her that she could stay in an apartment that he had. He claimed the previous tenant had quit her job and run off, leaving random things behind, including clothes. He told Alicia she was welcome to have any of it. The apartment, which was Izabela's, was pretty bare, and Alicia opted not to stay there, though she did go through and take some of the clothing. That clothing would later be identified as Izabela's. We're going to get a little bit more into Alicia's story in part 3. The lease on Izabela's apartment wouldn't be up until January or February of 2000, but John terminated it early. He paid September's rent and then told the management that he was no longer living there. When the apartment was inspected for the return of the security deposit, it was reportedly mostly empty and dirty, with the exception of 2 bedrooms, which were spotless and clearly recently scrubbed. Using all of these points on a timeline, it looks like Izabela was killed in July or August of 1999. Her family, however, got an email from her in April of 2000 claiming she was traveling the world and had just spent 2 weeks in China. This email in tone didn't match Izabela's previous email, so they thought it was odd, but maybe she was maturing as the email was polite, whereas she had not always been polite with her parents in the past. With Izabela out of the way, his wife at home, and his girlfriend Barbara in an apartment, John was online trying to talk another woman into moving to Kansas City for a BDSM relationship. And that is how he met Suzette Trouten. Suzette was born in April 1972, and she was the youngest of 5 children. She was a bit of a free spirit and definitely independent. She was the kid who didn't see why she couldn't do everything her older siblings could do, without considering that her older siblings also weren't allowed to do those things at her age. After her parents divorced, Suzette had some rocky years behavior-wise and ended up dropping out of high school. She worked fast food type jobs, which gave her enough money to buy a computer and eventually get onto the internet. In spite of Suzette's desire to do things her own way, she was still very close to her family, particularly her mother, and she never strayed far from home. Even when she moved out, she stayed in the Monroe, Michigan area on the shores of Lake Erie and talked to her mom daily. But the one thing she didn't talk to her mom about was the same thing a lot of us don't talk to our parents about, and that's her sex life. Suzette was active in the local BDSM community and had a regular dominant partner who lived in the area. Suzette eventually started working as a nurse's aide for home hospice care service, and she was incredible at her job. It made her hope that one day she could afford to go to nursing school. In the summer of 1999, Suzette was 28 and she met John Robinson online. He had said that he was building out a website for the International Council of Masters, which is the BDSM community he was part of. and Suzette offered to help him. Like everyone else in the online space, she thought he was a wealthy businessman with nearly unlimited resources. That is what he told everyone. As they got to know each other, Suzette told John that she was a nurse's aide, and John thought that was an amazing coincidence because he just so happened to need someone to care for his elderly father. They lived in Kansas but traveled a lot through the U.S. and Europe, and they were even planning a private yacht trip from California to Hawaii and Australia. John offered Suzette an annual salary that was 3 times what she made at the time. And that was on top of all of this travel and the yacht trip, which was all paid for. All that, and just to care for one elderly man. It was truly a remarkable job since John's father had been dead for 10 years at this point, but of course, Suzette didn't know that. When Suzette ran the job by people in her life, like we've heard before, it sounded too good to be true. Her sister thought that the job had come through the staffing agency they used, so she assumed it must be legitimate no matter how odd it sounded. And when Suzette told her current boss about it, she straight out told Suzette that no home healthcare job that was on the up and up paid that much. Suzette told a little white lie and said that she had connected with this man through a staffing agency, which we know was not true. But what was she going to say? She met him on a BDSM chat room? Suzette decided to take a chance, and she told John she was interested in the job, but she wanted to meet him and his father first to decide if it was a good fit. John sent her a round-trip plane ticket, and she was in Kansas for a few days in October of 1999. No one really knows what happened over those 5 days, but if she met any old man, it couldn't have been John's father. When Suzette got home from the trip, she confided in her mother that she wasn't sure she was up for being that far away from home for that long, but she figured if she worked the job for 1 year with all these expenses paid, she could save the money and finally go to nursing school. It was just too good of an opportunity to pass up. Suzette went back to Kansas in November to sign contracts and find a place to live for the times they weren't traveling. One of the contracts she signed was a slave master contract with John. She then returned to Michigan, where she started packing, picked up an application for her passport, and even looked at online schools in Belgium and Switzerland, because John told her that they would be there long enough that she could take some classes in her free time. John, having paid for Suzette to fly to Kansas City twice and paying all of her expenses while she was there, did help make this job seem more legitimate for both Suzette and her family. As Suzette's moving date got closer, she told her online friend Lars that she was pretty nervous about it. She wasn't used to being away from home that long, but she was excited for the opportunities she had in front of her with John, who Lars knew just as JR. In mid-February of 2000, Suzette picked up a moving truck that John had rented for her, loaded it up with her things she was taking and her 2 Pekingese dogs, and drove down to Kansas, arriving on February 14th. The initial plan, she had been told, was that they were going to leave for Europe in March. They'd be there for a few weeks before returning to the U.S. Right before Suzette left Michigan, though, John told her the plan had changed. They would actually be gone for more like 6 months on that first trip. When Suzette arrived in Kansas, John booked her into a hotel and she returned the rental truck. Based on what she told her online friend Lars, Suzette and John were in a sexual relationship at this point, which Lars had warned her against. John was supposedly her boss, and mixing those relationships was a recipe for trouble. After a week in the hotel with nothing to do and no car to use to drive around and get anywhere, John told Suzette that they were leaving soon. The plan was to drive to California and set sail. They'd be gone for 2 to 6 months, heading out to Hawaii and then Australia. But then he suddenly pushed the trip off another week, leaving Suzette still sitting in that hotel. At first, she at least had her dogs with her and she could go out and walk them a bit. But then the hotel found out that they were there, and they had a pretty strict no pet policy even for small dogs, and John ended up boarding them at a local kennel. He told the people at the kennel that the dogs would be there until the end of February. So Suzette was in the hotel room alone except for John's visits, and she spent a lot of time just chatting online with friends and calling her mother daily. Because Suzette had her computer with her and she was talking to friends, we do have some idea of what was going on, but she wasn't entirely forthcoming about everything, so it's just snapshots. Her friends did think it was weird that John had uprooted her life and paid for her to come to Kansas to care for his father, and then had her just sitting around and not working for 2 weeks. It started to sound like he lured her down there, and her real quote-unquote job was to be his submissive sex partner, which was consensual as a relationship goes, but it wasn't the reason she moved. On March 1st, a little before 1 a.m., Suzette was chatting with her friend Laura online and mentioned that she and John, who she was still referring to as JR, were leaving in the morning for California, but they were making a couple of stops first. They had to pick up the dogs at the kennel, and John wanted to show Suzette his farm in Lynn County. The two chatted until 12:51 a.m. Shortly after that, Suzette called her mother Carolyn at work as she worked the overnight shift, and she said that she and John were leaving for California later in the morning. These were the last confirmed communications from Suzette. Later that day, around 2:30 in the afternoon, Animal Control in Olathe, Kansas got a call that 2 stray dogs were running around a mobile home park, the same one that John's wife, Nancy, managed. Someone had apparently wrangled them into a pet carrier by the time the officers got there, and they were waiting just outside Nancy's office door. Seeing 2 well-groomed, purebred Pekingese dogs on a call for strays surprised the officer. So he asked the office manager for more information about them. Surely they belonged to a resident. The office manager said she didn't know when or where they had been picked up or anything else about them. She had just been instructed to call Animal Control to come get them. So the officer took them to the pound to wait for the owner to claim them. These were clearly someone's pets, and they hadn't been in the elements too long based on the great state of their coats. But when no owner came forward and the stray hold expired, they were quickly adopted, just as small purebred dogs usually are. Like in the other cases we've discussed, family and friends were not immediately alarmed because they kept getting communication from Suzette. No more phone calls, but emails. The day after Suzette supposedly left for California, her friend Laura got an email saying she was off on the adventure of a lifetime. She would only have access to the internet at internet cafes along their drive to California, so she promised to keep in contact, though it would be sporadic. Laura emailed back as usual and mentioned that she had just broken things off with her own dominant partner. Suzette emailed back that she knew her boss's friend in Kansas City would make a good master for Laura if she was interested, and sent her an email address for this friend, who she referred to as JT. JT was Jim Turner, aka John Robinson's favorite alias. Laura connected with JT online, and so John was emailing Laura as both JT and Suzette at this time, and well, he was not very good at keeping it straight. Laura noticed that Suzette's writing style changed, and it was almost identical to JT's, but the real red flag was that there were times Laura would mention something to Suzette in an email, and then JT would reference that information in an email he wrote back to her. Suzette was on the road and JT was back in Kansas City, so how would he know some relatively minor detail Laura had emailed to Suzette? Like I said, John was not good at juggling accounts, and Laura knew something was wrong. Her initial fear was that this was a trafficking situation that Suzette had gotten lured into, and someone had control of her email account. Laura kept emailing back and forth with both JT and Suzette, concerned about Suzette, but without enough information to do anything about it. She only knew the man who hired Suzette as JR, and he had a friend, JT, and they lived in the Kansas City area. That wasn't much, but if she kept communication open, maybe she could get more information that she could do something about. Lars spoke with another friend about her concerns, and this friend decided to jump into it too. So Lars told JT that her friend was looking for a master, and JT then had a friend named Tom who was interested. Tom provided a couple phone numbers to the friend, so Lars gave the numbers to Suzette's ex-boyfriend, who was a police officer in Michigan, and he ran them all, and they all came back to John Robinson of Olathe, Kansas. This was finally a piece to the puzzle. JR's real name was John Robinson. As this was happening between John and Lars, Suzette's family were also getting concerned. After last speaking to Suzette on the phone on March 1st, knowing she was leaving for California in the morning, Carolyn was surprised to get a letter in the mail from Suzette that was postmarked in Kansas City on March 6th. She should have been 5 days into her travels by then. The letter was dated prior to that, February 28th, and it talked about all the plans about going to California. Suzette's father in Florida got a similar letter, also dated February 28th, but postmarked on March 6th. The letters were in Suzette's handwriting, but it was odd to get mail from Suzette at all, as she preferred email and phone calls. And then it seemed like someone, for some strange reason, held on to the letters for a week and then mailed them from Kansas City when Suzette should have been gone already. Carolyn called John Robinson to ask what was going on, and he said that Suzette ended up not taking the job that she had moved to Kansas City for. Instead, she met a man named Jim Turner and ran off with him, having stolen money from John in the process. He was as eager to talk to Suzette as anyone. A few weeks later, Carolyn got another letter postmarked from San Jose, California. It had Suzette's signature, but the letter was typed. It said she was off on an adventure of a lifetime, a turn of phrase Carolyn never heard from her daughter before. It just wasn't how she spoke. The next mailing came in late March, and it was a birthday card for Suzette's grandmother. It was also postmarked from San Jose. Suzette's father also received a letter with the same postmark. There were also emails sent to the family during this time, none typical of Suzette's writing style. Most notably, she spelled her own dog's name wrong. Since the last place the family knew Suzette was living was a hotel in Overland Park, they called the police there and reported that they were concerned for her well-being on March 25th. They gave the name John Robinson as the employer, and that's when they found out that John Robinson was already under investigation in the neighboring city of Lenexa for another complaint. The police in Lenexa asked Suzette's family for all of her correspondence, and to get more information, the family also reached out to Lars, who told them everything she knew. She did gently warn the family that this would expose some of Suzette's private life, things they may not want to hear about, but with everyone's concerns for Suzette's safety, they would have to just push through that. To explain why John Robinson was already on the police radar at this point, it turned out it had to do with an interesting Kansas law. The state requires that extended stay hotels provide the police with a list of guests each week. The police department sends an officer to pick up the list, and the front desk of one extended stay in Lenexa alerted this officer to one of their guests, John Robinson. John was a frequent flyer at this hotel. He would always book the same room, but he didn't usually stay in the room the whole time. It would always be a woman that he would put up there, who would then stay until it was time to check out. One day in March of 2000, a woman who was staying in that room went to the front desk and asked if they could run off some copies for her. They said, of course. The first copy, however, messed up, so the clerk threw it in the trash, finished making the clean copies, and handed it all back to the woman. He hadn't really looked at what the document was, but boredom mixed with curiosity had him pulling out the messed up copy from the trash just to see what it was. At the top, it was labeled as a master-slave contract. Not sure what he was looking at, and not sure it was legal and or consensual, he put it aside and made a note to tell the police about it when they came by. The officer ran a background check on John Robinson and found his extensive criminal record, mostly related to fraud, but he did notice that John's name came up in the missing persons cases related to a mother and daughter, Lisa and Tiffany Stacy. They also reached out to the FBI and learned that John had been under investigation in the 1980s in regards to sex trafficking from the apartment he rented on Troost, something that could never be proven. But this brought up a concern that this master-slave contract was some part of a sex trafficking ring. And now they have another woman connected to John whose family is saying she is missing. So this triggered a full investigation into John Robinson, including the formation of a task force. That is why we have had so much information out there on Suzette's case compared to others like Catherine Clampett and Paula Godfrey. This case was investigated thoroughly and immediately. By late March, the police were actively looking for Suzette as they had John under surveillance, and they questioned the housekeeping staff at the hotel where Suzette stayed. The housekeeper said that there had been blood on the sheets and towels after she checked out, but not enough to alert the police, more like a nosebleed or maybe even a heavy period. In mid-April, the investigators learned about the dogs having been picked up from where John lived, and they tracked down the adopter of one of them. They went into the house and called both dogs names. The dog responded to one of them, confirming that these dogs that had been picked up were Suzette's. And that's when her family really knew this was not going to end with good news because Suzette never would have left her dogs. On April 23rd, 2000, John checked into the extended stay hotel again and showed up with a woman who he had met online. She had flown up from Dallas to have sex with him. She had cautioned, warned, told her friends about what she was doing, and so they all set up a safety plan. She would call every 3 hours, and if she missed even one call, the friend would notify the authorities. While in the room with John, he tied her up consensually, but then he started taking pictures of her non-consensually. When she told him to stop, he hit her and just kept taking the photographs. She then told him about the arrangement she had with her friend and said if she missed a call, the police would be on their way. At this point, John stopped, and he told her to go back to Dallas, but get ready to move to Kansas City. He was leaving on an overseas trip later that day, but a moving truck would show up at her house when it was time to go. So she went back to Dallas and started packing. She told herself that the incident with John was just him going a little too far in their dominant, submissive encounter, and it was a one-time thing. She waited on the moving truck, and it never showed. She called John, who dodged her calls for a bit, and when he answered, she told him that he had to send back her things that she had left up in Kansas City, which were mostly expensive sex toys. Hearing this, John threatened that he was going to send the photos he took to the board that oversaw her license and ruin her career. Realizing she was being blackmailed, she went to the police, who took the report seriously because John was already on their radar for something worse, either human trafficking or murder or both. In the meantime, the task force kept having those close to Suzette, like her mother Carolyn and her friend Lars, stay in touch with John so they could monitor what he was saying to them. In a recorded call, Carolyn told John she was worried about Suzette since it wasn't like her to be out of touch for weeks. She said she was getting really nervous, and John told her not to worry. Suzette and the guy she left with were out on a boat, which just made it hard for them to stay in touch. Carolyn said she was wondering if she should call the police at this point to report her missing. John immediately discouraged her from this, saying that Suzette was fine and she was a big girl who could take care of herself. The conversation continued for a little bit, and Carolyn brought up again reporting Suzette missing, and John again said he wouldn't worry about it, and he was sure they would hear from Suzette when she hit port again. John was emailing similar sentiments to Lars, telling her that his accountant had found $10,000 in fraudulent charges to his credit card. He suspected they had been made by Suzette, so he called the stores where the cards were used to get the security footage to see if it was her. He also said he hired a PI to track her down and asked Lars for more information about Suzette's friends in Michigan to pass on to this private investigator. These communications told the investigators two things. One, John was fishing for information on Suzette's life, which would likely be information he could then use in letters and emails to prove Suzette was sending them. And then two, he had no idea the police were already involved. It wasn't until early May of 2000 that John may have suspected he was under investigation. He had been watched and followed by the police for several weeks at that point, and then very suddenly started changing his routine and habits. Around that same time, he installed security cameras on the outside of his home. John also started possibly making plans to leave the area. In the background of all of this, his old friend/girlfriend Barbara was still living in Kansas City and thinking she and John had a typical relationship. She told him that her parents were aging and needing help in the house, so he encouraged her to move back to Canada to be with them, and he said he would join her in late June. But if John knew he was under investigation like it looked like, he didn't manage to stay on his best behavior. In mid-May, with his girlfriend off to Canada, he flew in another woman he met online and put her in that extended stay. The sexual relationship began consensual, but he was going too far, and when she told him to stop, he refused. After this, he told her to pack her stuff and leave. He left her stranded outside the hotel with nothing but her luggage. She called the police and reported the assault. Around the same time, Suzette's family got another round of letters from her, all of them postmarked from Veracruz, Mexico. In the letters, Suzette said she was having a wonderful time with Jim Turner and that the dogs were with her and having a great time as well. This was proof positive these letters were not coming from Suzette since they knew where the dogs were. They were in their adoptive homes in the Kansas City area. But there was something else about these letters. The letters were definitely sent from Veracruz. The police had been following John Robinson around. Had he gone to Mexico to mail those letters on Suzette's behalf, they would have known about it. But that question seemed to be answered when they followed up on a lead from early April when they searched John's trash. In that trash, they found a receipt from a package John had sent out to San Jose, California. In following up with this and asking the woman who received the package about it, she said that John had sent her some letters to mail for him. That explained the California letters from Suzette, so it may explain other letters received, not just by Suzette's family, but also Beverly's. Those were postmarked from around the world. John may have mailed them to online friends who simply dropped them in a mailbox for him. Now, in the case of the Veracruz letters, that's not exactly how it happened. It turned out that he had given them to the mother of a friend who was visiting from Mexico, and he just asked her to mail them when she got home. As the task force was collecting this evidence, it was always questioned if they had enough to make an arrest. They worried that if John was free for too long, it would give him a chance to kill again. So they started booking the hotel rooms on either side of the one he rented just to keep an eye on things. And when they found out in early June that he was talking to a woman about coming to his farm in Lynn County, they knew they had to move. That was the last thing Suzette said before she went missing, that John was taking her out to the farm. The investigators applied for an arrest warrant for sexual battery on the two women who made complaints against John and for theft of stealing that one woman's sex toys. On the morning of June 2nd, 2000, John was arrested at his Olathe home. They immediately searched that home and then a storage unit in Olathe that John rented. In the storage locker, they had found a briefcase that contained Suzette's personal documents like her passport application, her social security card, and birth certificate, as well as her prescription medication, her driver's license journal, and even her Sam's Club membership card. It also had her signed BDSM slave master contract in there, and a stun gun, and then other evidence of their BDSM relationship. Later, Suzette's family would identify nursing textbooks, jewelry, and collectibles found there as Suzette's. But that wasn't all they found. In that unit, right near the briefcase, was a plastic bin that held documents belonging to Izabela Lewicka. including her driver's license, college ID, resident alien card, library card, and a document that made John her power of attorney. There was also a photo of her naked, lying on a bed. The task force at this point did not know anything about Izabela because she wasn't always in contact with her family, and because they were still getting random communication from her, they hadn't reported her missing because they didn't know she was missing. And everyone who knew her in Kansas had been told she had been deported and had no reason to think otherwise. So the investigators, as they're in the storage locker, weren't quite sure how Izabela connected to all of this. The investigators also found blank sheets of paper with just Suzette and Izabela's signatures at the bottom, as well as some envelopes that were addressed to their family members. Nancy Robinson, John's wife, who he was still living with, was questioned by the police. She said she didn't really know a lot about what John did, though she did know that he regularly stepped outside of the marriage. There wasn't much she could offer, and it's a similar situation that we have seen with other serial killers and their wives. On June 3rd, 2000, the day after the arrest, the 16-acre Lynn County farm was searched with cadaver dogs. The dogs pretty much immediately alerted on 55-gallon barrels that were located outside of the trailer by a shed on the property. They opened them, and inside 2 of the 4 barrels were the remains of 2 women. Both were blindfolded and had ropes around their necks. They were transported to the medical examiner for examination and identification. Over the course of the investigation, while John Robinson was still free, the police learned that John was a fan of shredding papers. One day when they were going through his trash, they managed to piece together enough shredded paper to learn that John had been paying for a storage unit in Raymore, Missouri that was not under his own name. After his arrest, they worked with the Missouri authorities to get a warrant to search it. In the storage unit, wrapped in plastic and with items piled on top, they found 3 more large barrels. They opened one of them and saw a shoe, a brown sheet, and a pair of glasses. They went to move the shoe and realized it was on a foot. They decided to not go any further in the storage unit and to transport all 3 barrels intact to the medical examiner's office. And all 3 of them contained the bodies of women. The manager of the storage facility was questioned, and she said that John was chatty and friendly. He mentioned storing furniture for his sister, Beverly, while she was out of the country, and the investigators took note of the name. They didn't quite know who Beverly was, but they knew she wasn't his sister. After the bodies were found, John Robinson's bail was raised to $5 million. And my voice, as I'm getting over a cold, is not going to hang on much longer, so we're going to break here. And in the last part of this, we'll get into the identifications of the victims, the legal proceedings, and the real questions at the root of this case. We have 8 victims, but only 5 bodies. Where are the other 3? And are there more victims? Thank you for listening. You can find Crimelines on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and occasionally TikTok. Crimelines is on Patreon, where I offer early and ad-free episodes as well as bonus content. Visit patreon.com/crimelines. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crimelines, you can give a one-time donation at basementfortproductions.com/support. And if you need a palate cleanser after listening to heavier true crime shows, check out Rusty Hinges, an allegedly funny history, mystery, and true crime show that I co-created and write for.